Those of us who were brought up in southern Rhodesia in the 1940s, 50s, 60s will remember very well the large avuncular figure of our Prime Minister, the federal Prime Minister, who one day admitted that as a young boy he had swum bare-assed in the Matsheumhlope. Well, you could do that in Harare, but you could also do it in Bulawayo, in the Matsheumhlope. And the Matsheumhlope River plays a little bit in a part in our story today, which is about Carol and her relationship when she went to boarding school. Not the happiest time of her life. Carol ran as fast as she could, racking sobs tearing through her chest, as though her heart would break. She ducked round the toilet block, squeezing behind the rough brick bath fire. She heard them dash past, shouting and egging each other on. Come on, she can't escape. Come down here. Please, God, help me, Carol nearly screamed. Please help me. Her pursuers ran off down another path away from the toilet block. Carol pulled herself tight into her hiding place, right beside the water tank, and wept soundlessly, her chest aching with suppressed sobs. When she was sure there was nobody around, she moved cautiously towards her hostel, taking the back way. The path meandered down along the Matsheumhlope River. Even though the schoolgirls weren't supposed to go there, Carol just loved it and went there every time she possibly could to escape when school got too horrid. There was a small squeeze-into space in the long grass, had been carefully chosen to make sure nobody could find her. It gave her peace in the smell of the bush and the croaks and the warbles of frogs and birds. It wasn't much of a river either, a little wandering river with a big name, the Matsheumhlope. More a trickle of muddy water most of the time until the storms came. Then, of course, it would roar and swirl about. But most important of all, it reminded her of home. The thick leaves of the gum trees gave her some dappled shade, while the tall elephant grass growing on both sides gave her plenty of other places to hide if she needed to. She knew that the girls who were chasing her were townies. They didn't like the long grass because they were scared of scorpions and snakes, but she was used to them, and she just looked out for telltale signs before she sat down. Today, she knew Mum and Dad would collect her for her first half-term exeat at 5:30, and her eyes brimmed with a sudden rush of hot tears at the thought of just seeing them again. She had safely reached her special hiding place, and she sat in and put her head on her knees. Oh, she hated school so much. Why did they have to live in Tjolotjo, so far away from this dreadful school in Bulawayo? She knew she had to go to boarding school because there were no schools for her in Tjolotjo. But knowing that didn't help how much she hated being there. She still had an hour to wait, and she didn't want to chance running into the bully girls again. As she sat with her head on her knees, she thought how things had changed, of how much she hated school now, and of how much she had loved school before. But that was when Mum taught her by correspondence school, and it was such fun every week, nipping around to rip open these brown paper parcels, which came all the way from Australia. Afterwards, she'd take her books down to the big fig to teach Prune. He was slow, and she would have to be fierce with him, because he'd rather go hunting antlions and do sums and spelling. He couldn't go to school at the native department because his father wasn't employed there. And he couldn't even go to Dad's school either, because Dad couldn't show favoritism. And now the waiting lists were so long. So he did listen sometimes, and he did learn his spelling and his sums. Then one day, Prune was better than Carol at sums, and she was not happy about that. When she was 10, correspondence school stopped. Mum and Dad said she would now go to boarding school. Her brother Tim would also go to boarding school, and he was only 6. He was very frightened. He sat quietly with his eyes very, very wide and his bottom lip shaking when Mum and Dad told them. And so the day had come. They both got in the car to go to boarding school. Mum wore dark glasses because she was crying all the way to Bulawayo. Carol wanted to put her head on her lap and hold on to her forever, but she couldn't because Mum was in the front and she was in the back. So she and Tim huddled together and were miserable. Dad knew the headmistress of the boarding school and said, "She is a very good headmistress. The school will be the making of you, and you will learn better at school than you would with Mum." Carol wasn't so sure about that. She was even less sure when they drove up to a huge brick building. It was the biggest she'd ever seen, with a long up staircase inside. It was nothing like that in Tjolotjo. Dad took out her trunk and was told where to put it so it could be carried up the stairs later. Then they went to see the headmistress. Carol sat quiet as a mouse, wishing she could just go home. "Cat got your tongue, girl?" Carol jumped in fright. She couldn't speak and looked desperately at Mum. "She's very shy," said Mum. "Oh, thank you, Mum." This was a strict headmistress. The time came to say goodbye. Tim was being brave and wouldn't kiss her goodbye. He tucked in his chin, making his fair hair droop down over his eyes. He wouldn't even look at her. She had to be brave too, so she waved and straight smiled as she carried the smallest case in. It had now been 6 weeks since that first day to this first half-term exeat, and she still couldn't sleep at night or eat her supper. There were girls from South Africa in the hostel, and they spoke differently, and they teased her because she spoke proper English. Miss Hoity-toity, they called her. They hated her because Dad was head of a school which was teaching black boys. "What's your dad doing teaching bloody..." Carol couldn't even say or think the word because it was banned at home. Then they had the initiation ceremonies. Carol felt tears slide down her face as she remembered the horror of the initiation and how she'd vomited everywhere and had to clean it up. Then, even though it wasn't her fault, she got an order mark, and the bully girls hated her even more. She heard a bell ring. It was 5:30. She'd been thinking so much, she'd forgotten the time. "Wait, Mum and Dad, I'm coming, I'm coming." She raced to the hostel driveway, frantic with worry, then relief to see them there. She burst into tears. Mum burst into tears. Even Dad looked teary, while Tim sat in the back seat, pink in the face. "Come on, my girl. I've got your suitcase. Where have you been?" She was crying too much to say anything. She climbed into the back of the car and they set off onto the Victoria Falls Road. She kept saying out loud, but quietly, as they passed all the signposts and the words that were so much a part of her life and home. Tjolotjo, meat of the elephant. Tjolotjo, skull of the elephant. They were going home at last. As they drove further out of Bulawayo, the rain came lashing down. "The earth is crying with me," she thought as she stared past the ribbons of water streaming down the window. The car bumped and swerved over the narrow tarmac strips, with Dad really struggling to pull it back after they passed another car or lorry, always trying to make sure there was a strip for the wheels to hang on to, at least on one side, as the rain was making everything so slippery and hard to see. They drove slowly and carefully. It was already dark, and Dad didn't want to hit a big buck or worse, an elephant. Carol and Tim just wanted to get home. It poured and poured. Dad said he thought it might be wise to pull into the Gwai River Hotel, as the bridge could be underwater. Suddenly, well, there it was, a place where they'd always had fun. "Come in, come in," the voice of Mrs. Barron echoed into the distance. "You'll be soaking wet. Have you had supper?" "We've just picked the kids up from school. Can we stay?" "Yes, we'd love supper." "Is the Gwai over the bridge?" Many questions, much laughter, countless hugs. Beers went round, Fantas for the kids, followed by huge family-sized omelettes. "Ostrich eggs," Mrs. Barron boomed. "Yummy," Carol thought. But she couldn't eat more than 2 spoons. "Feeling car sick, Mum?" More hugs, then off to bed. She was sharing a room with Timothy. "Hey, Tim, you okay at boarding school?" she asked with concern. "Yeah, fine." "You got some friends?" "Yeah, lots." But Carol knew he was not quite telling the truth, because his eyes were droopy and he didn't look at her. She was sad and tired, so tired, but she couldn't sleep, even though Tim went to sleep straight away. So she lay quiet and thought about the wonderful times they had had in the swimming pool at this hotel. How sometimes they'd be swimming and the zebras would just stand, looking and waiting. When they got out of the pool, then they'd come and drink. And she remembered the playground and Mr. and Mrs. Barron and how much she loved them. The door opened and Mum peeped in, carrying one of those pump-up lamps. Carol shut her eyes tight and pretended to be asleep. Mum stroked her face and kissed her goodnight, then stroked Tim's face and kissed him goodnight too. They spent the morning at the hotel, waiting for the Gwai River to go down, sharing a breakfast of bacon and eggs and sausages and tomatoes, and everyone agreed nothing had ever tasted so good. Then the sun came out, and Mum and Dad played tennis, while Carol and Tim played putt-putt and swam, before going to stare at all the animal heads and stuffed fish in the big sitting room. Tim showed off by telling her all the names of the animals and the fish. At last, they were told that the Gwai had gone down and it was safe to cross the bridge. Carol hated crossing the bridge while the water was still speeding over it in a hump. She imagined the truck being swept down and gobbled up by the roaring and swirling of the water. But Dad was cautious and went walking into the water, tapping with a stick to make sure it was shallow enough. "Oh, Dad, please be careful." Half term was 5 days, 5 wonderful days. But still, Carol couldn't eat or sleep. Mum and Dad were worried, and they had every reason to be worried. But you can see the character of Carol coming through, rather a nervous child, rather a nervous adult, and always, it seems, on the wrong side of where she should be. Next week, Timber learns all about a remarkable great-grandfather. I hope you'll join me then.